Hello and welcome. My name is John Acuff and I am here today to talk to you about Housing 101. We are delighted that you have chosen housing as a career. We believe this will be a very rewarding career for you. You will develop some very important skills and you will be able to hopefully grow within the housing field or use these skills in other areas to help you achieve your professional goals. Our goals here today is to understand the basics of housing. Now, I'm assuming most of you watching this video maybe never worked for a housing authority before, or maybe have never worked at the Miami-Dade Housing Authority. So let's talk about what our learning objectives are for this session. We want to recognize the importance of affordable housing in Miami-Dade County. We also want to gain an awareness of the structure of the Miami-Dade Housing Authority, as well as its relationship with Nan McKay and Associates, which you should have learned about in the previous module. We want to understand the occupancy cycle and the process for how a person comes onto the program from the point of view of the client. We want to be able to identify different types of vouchers, and we also want to be able to locate the rules for the program. So why does housing matter? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Everyone needs a place to live. A home is our shelter. It provides a place of retreat and replenishment. And unfortunately, affordable housing, especially in metropolitan areas like Miami, is becoming more and more scarce. Now, Miami-Dade County has experienced rapid growth, population, and development in recent years. Why is that? Well, everyone wants to get out of the cold and experience the South Florida way of life. And this influx of new residents and developments of high-end units have resulted in many rising housing costs for Miami-Dade households. Actually, there's some staggering statistics about the problems of affordable housing in the Miami-Dade area. Now, everyone knows that when you do your budget, you take a look at your income and you take a look at your expenses. So you have your income and then you look at what you're spending on food, utilities, rent, entertainment, things of that nature. Generally, experts say that an individual should pay no more than 30% of their income towards rent and utilities. And in Miami-Dade, we have some statistics to show that most of the Miami-Dade residents are experiencing what is called a rent burden. Now, let me explain to you what that concept means, rent burden. A rent burden is defined as a household whose rent and utilities is in excess of 30% of their income. And statistics show in Miami-Dade County, approximately 60% of the residents who live here are experiencing a rent burden, which means when they get their paycheck, so much of that goes to rent, they have difficulty meeting their other financial obligations. So how do we help in this? Well, we issue the family a voucher. The voucher is designed to create affordable housing for the family. The family gets the voucher and they can pick any unit they want to within the Miami-Dade region. It has to pass certain requirements, and we'll talk about what those requirements are. But what the voucher is designed to do, as long as the family stays within the value of that voucher, and we'll talk about specifically how much each voucher is worth, that typically depends on the number of people in the family and the number of bedrooms that they qualify for. So typically, if they stay below what their voucher covers, their rent and utilities will not be more than 30% of their income. So it's designed to make their rent affordable because the more income you have, the more rent you will pay. The less income you have, the less rent you will pay. Now, in the event that the family finds a unit where the total rent and utilities is more than what their voucher is worth, then they will have to pay 30% plus a little extra. But the idea behind that is it's called Housing Choice Voucher. We're trying to create housing opportunities for the family. So if they have a little bit of extra income and they can pay a little bit more, HUD will allow them to do that. But HUD has only one caveat, is that when they're moving into the unit for the very first time, they cannot pay more than 40%. So HUD doesn't want to set the family up for failure. They don't want them to be what is called rent poor, which basically means all of their money goes to rent and they have no other money to meet other financial obligations.
The MDHCV has a payment standard for different sized units in Miami-Dade. This is a calculation that adds standard rents plus utility allowances throughout the county. This is the payment standard chart on the left. So for instance, a 2-bedroom has a payment standard of $1,235. A 4-bedroom has a payment standard of $1,963, and so on and so forth. The amount of help that the MDHCV will pay on your behalf is called Housing Assistance Payment, also known as the HAP. This payment standard is the maximum housing assistance payment, or HAP, that the MDHCV program will pay on your behalf each month. On the other hand, the amount of money you can afford to pay monthly for rent and utilities is called the total tenant payment. Your total tenant payment, or TTP, is calculated by figuring out 30% of your monthly income, since 30% is a calculated percentage for monthly rent, as figured out by HUD. So as you can imagine, the TTP is different for every family. The maximum percentage that HUD has calculated is affordable for any family is 40%. In addition, as part of all of these calculations, the MDHCV also calculates a utility allowance for every family. For more details on how to calculate your utility allowance, take a look at your handbook. Let's make an example scenario to try to add everything up. We'll make up the head of an imaginary household and we'll call her, let's say, Susan. Susan has 2 little ones. Susan is employed and her household's monthly adjusted income is $1,430. The adjusted income adds up all sources of income that the household generates, which is required to be reported to the IRS. 30% of Susan's adjusted income would be $429. This is Susan's TTP. We'll make note of that number. When selecting a unit, the MDHCV program has to figure out if rent plus utilities for that unit is below or above that payment standard. Remember the payment standard from before? Yep, that one. Let's illustrate that with our first scenario. If Susan finds a place where the unit's rent is $900 and Susan's utility allowance is $100, we add those two up for a total of $1,000. $1,000 is less than the payment standard of $1,235. So the MDHCV program will use the $1,000 gross rent number instead. So the math will go like this. $1,000 of gross rent minus $429 for Susan's TTP equals $571 paid in housing assistance, or HAP, by MDHCV to the owner. $900 for rent only minus $571 for HAP equals $329 paid by Susan to the unit's owner. In addition, utilities will also be Susan's responsibility. On the other hand, if Susan selects a unit where the rent plus utilities is more than the payment standard, the family will be allowed to pay up to 40% of their monthly income. Anything above 40% will be considered too expensive and therefore not allowed. For Susan, 40% of her gross income is $572. In our second scenario, Susan picks a unit where the rent is $1,200. With her utility allowance of $100, her gross rent is $1,300. The payment standard for a 2-bedroom is $1,235, so MDHCV uses that standard. Let's run the numbers. $1,235 payment standard minus $429 for Susan's TTP equals $806 paid in HAP by the MDHCV program to the owner. $1,200 rent only minus $806 paid in HAP equals $394 paid by Susan. $394 for rent plus $100 for Susan's utility allowance equals $494 that Susan will pay for rent and utilities. $494 for rent and utilities is less than $572, which was the maximum that Susan was allowed to contribute. So this unit is still considered affordable.
So let's talk a little bit about Miami-Dade Public Housing and Community Development. So Miami-Dade is one of the largest housing authorities in the nation. It currently has 9,200 public housing units and administers approximately 14,000 vouchers. The jurisdiction is the County of Miami-Dade, which is one of the largest counties in the nation. As some of you know, if you're from South Florida, it extends, starts in the Broward area up to almost where Fort Lauderdale is, and ends, as you can see on the map here, ends in the Homestead area. So we're talking about a very large geographical area in which we serve families. Let's talk about the general structure of a housing authority. The structure is similar to a public corporation. You have a board of commissioners. Generally, the Board of Commissioners are appointed by the local government. So the mayor, the commissioner, the local government has a say on who those commissioners are. The Board of Commissioners has an executive director, and the executive director, as you can see on the slide there, reports directly to the Board of Commissioners. So the Board of Commissioners, their role or their function is to determine the policy, approve the budgets, and they, of course, have one employee, which is the executive director, currently a function occupied by Michael Yu. Now, Michael Yu, his job is to be the CEO or the executive director for the housing authority. So he hires the staff, he makes all of the decisions regarding the management and things of that nature. But as you can see on the next slide, there is a different relationship because the Miami-Dade program has decided not to directly administer the program. They have contracted with an organization called Nan McKay & Associates. You were, of course, recently hired to work for Nan McKay & Associates, and we, Nan McKay, directly administer this program. So you can see the relationship between PHCD, Nan McKay, and the staff. Now, this particular housing authority, Miami-Dade Housing Authority, has two different vendors. One, of course, being NMA, and the other being CVR & Associates. So Nan McKay & Associates pretty much handles all of the functions regarding the voucher administration, eligibility, recertifications, terminations. All of those things are handled directly out of our office. There's another company called CVR & Associates, and they handle two functions. One is called inspections. Now, to make sure that we're not using taxpayer money to fund slumlords, we have an annual inspection, which is called a Housing Quality Standard Inspection, to ensure that the housing is decent, safe, and sanitary. And CVR also handles another function, which you'll learn more about, is an abatement, which is one of our remedies under our contract, which basically states that if a landlord is unwilling or unable to make repairs in a timely fashion, then the housing authority will withhold funds and stop paying until that particular landlord has cured or corrected the deficient item. So let's talk about a little bit different types of housing types that we have under the Housing Choice Voucher program that we administer here. So of course we have Housing Choice Voucher, we have something called Project-Based Voucher, we have Family Self-Sufficiency, the Home Ownership Program, the VASH program. So let's talk about each one. So like we said before, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is HUD's largest program to provide assistance to low-income families. Families are issued a voucher. They can search anywhere in our jurisdiction or outside of our jurisdiction under what is called portability. As you can see on the slide, the unit is owned by an owner in the private market, and the landlord receives his rent in two checks. One check comes from the tenant, which is designed to be affordable because it's based on 30% of their income. The other is called the HAP payment. Owners are happy when they receive HAP because that is the difference between the full rent and the portion paid by the tenant, which is designed to be affordable, which is again based on 30% of their income. So as we can see on the slide, the owner receives the full rent by two checks, one check being the HAP, the other check coming from the family. I want to draw your attention to the next slide. So this slide is probably one of the most important visuals when it comes to understanding the various entities within the Housing Choice Voucher Program and how they all connect. So you notice we have a triangle because we have three different entities. We have a housing authority, we have a family, and we have an owner. And you notice that there are three different contracts that bind these entities together. So let's talk about the first one. As you can see, the family connects directly with the housing authority through a document called the voucher. The voucher is what is issued to the family to help, which they need to use when they, which they utilize to select a unit. And it also has what's called family obligations. So typical family obligations are, tell us the truth about who lives with you and how much money everyone has. Tell us that don't engage in any criminal activity, pay your rent on time, things of that nature. So if the family has engaged in violent criminal activity, drug-related criminal activity, or other criminal activity which threatens the health and safety or right to peaceful enjoyment of others living on the premises, we will deny them admission to the Housing Choice Voucher Program if that criminal activity took place within the last 5 years. Now, in the event that the family does not adhere to the requirements of the voucher, the Housing Authority has the remedy to terminate their assistance. So those requirements are all spelled out in the voucher, and in the show notes we can give you a link to the voucher so you can read those direct requirements. Now, take a look at the right side. On the right side of the triangle, you have the Housing Authority connecting with the owner, and you have the Housing Assistance Payment, or otherwise known as HAP contract, tying these two entities together. Now notice the family is not a party to this document. So this is a contract between the Housing Authority and the owner, which governs the rules of the program for the owner and has our remedies, such as we mentioned in the previous slide, if an owner doesn't abide by his or her program requirements, we can exercise one of our remedies, which is withholding payments or terminating the contract. And at the bottom of our triangle, you notice you have a lease. The two entities tied to the lease are the family and the owner. So it's very important that you realize that the Housing Authority technically is not a party to this particular legal document. So we will often have in our career owners calling up or coming into the office stating your tenant is destroying my unit. And our response for that owner will have to be, of course, diplomatic as possible, is to convey that it is not our tenant. It is our participant in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but the terms of the document, the terms of the lease are between the family and the owner. And if the family is violating his or her lease, the owner has to exercise the remedies that they would under any other private market landlord-tenant, which would be to enforce their lease. And if anyone has ever worked in property management, there is a saying, it is easier to move someone in than it is to move them out. So what an owner should do prior to executing a lease with a prospective tenant is screen them based on their credit, based on their previous tenancy history, and determine whether they meet their suitability standards to reside in that particular unit. You will see, based on the triangle, that the Housing Authority does not perform that function. So let's talk about an overview of the process. The first thing that we have is what's called intake. So the family has to submit an application to go on the waiting list when the waiting list is open. Oftentimes, we will find that the waiting list is closed for extended periods of time because we have ample people on the list and we need to make sure that we have fully used that list before we start pulling families. So we call that initial process intake. There is actually a department called intake, so if you've been assigned to that particular team, you will be dealing with the families who are coming onto the program for the very first time. We'll talk about what is required to do what's called the initial lease up. And after they're leased up to the program, every year we have to verify the family's income and family composition. So we have to do a check of who lives in the unit and how much money they all have. Why do we do that? Well, as we saw from previous slides, the rent subsidy is determined by the amount of income that they have. So if that income is changed, we have to recalculate their subsidy based on the current levels. We call those annual reexaminations. We could also have a move. After the initial term of the lease, the family can move, but they have to go through a similar process that they went through when they came onto the program for the very first time. We have another part, which is called an interim. Now, in the private market, if an individual loses their job or has a change in their family composition, the rent does not change. But in affordable housing, it's a little bit different. A housing authority will conduct an interim if requested by the family, which means we will recalculate their rent based on their new set of circumstances, i.e. a change in income, there's a loss of income or an increase in income, or a change in family composition, someone has moved in or someone has moved out. So let's go through the process. It's important to know how the process works from a chronological perspective. So like I said before, the first thing that happens is the family applies. When the waiting list is open, and there will be a huge notification of the public, we'll have to print in local media that the waiting list is open, families will have the ability to apply. Usually those applications will be done online, but when that happens, we will announce the what, when, and how a family applies for housing. Then they will go on the waiting list. Now, how long does it take on the waiting list? Well, it depends depending on when they applied and what subsidy is available. But just to give you an idea, we are currently pulling people from the waiting list in 2018 that applied in 2008. So you don't have to be a mathematician to know that we are currently pulling people that applied for a voucher 10 years ago. Why does it take so long? Well, the percentage, I don't have those statistics in front of me, but the percentage is of families who qualified for a voucher substantially exceeds the number of vouchers available. So families have to wait their turn until one becomes available. So the next step is the family has to be determined eligible. Not anybody can walk into the housing authority and be eligible for the program. So what are we looking at? Well, typically we're looking to see if you meet the citizenship requirements. So usually voucher holders must be either United States citizens, refugees, asylum, or what's called a permanent resident alien. So they have to meet the citizenship requirements. They have to disclose their social security number. They have to pass what's called a criminal background check. Typically we're looking for serious criminal offenses, violent criminal activity, drug-related criminal activity, or other criminal activity that threatens the health and safety or right to peaceful enjoyment of other people living in the premises or vicinity. So those type of criminal activities, if they took place within the past 10 years, could potentially make someone not eligible for the program. Then they have to be below the income limit, and as you can see, this is an example of what the income limits were for 2018, but keep in mind those income limits are subject to change every year. So if they meet all of the factors of eligibility, they will move on to step 4, which is voucher issuance. Before you get the voucher though, we require everyone attend a briefing. The briefing is where we explain the rules of the program. So the idea is I don't just give the family the voucher and hope that everything works out. No, I want to set them up for success. So we explain how the program works, where they can use the voucher, how the payment standard works, what their portion will be, and things of that nature. Now, after the family has left the briefing, they're given a voucher and they're given a document, what's often called an RTA, which is moving on to step 5. RTA or RFTA stands for Request for Tenancy Approval. That is the document that the family submits. Actually, the owner would submit it, or the family. The owner would usually fill it out, and it is what they submit when they have located a unit. What we will do is we will do 2 things. We will determine if the unit exists in our software and if the vendor exists. If the unit doesn't exist, we'll have to create the unit. And if the vendor doesn't exist, meaning this particular owner has not participated in the Housing Choice Voucher program before, we'll have to create the vendor. But usually if it's an existing unit, an existing vendor, the process should take no more than 7 days to request what's called an inspection. So the next step is another company called CVR and Associates. Once we've set up the unit and requested the inspection, they will be the ones to go out and physically conduct the inspection. There are three results when an inspection takes place. The first is called pass, the next is called fail, the third is called inconclusive. Let's talk about what each three means. Pass means you're good to go. Everything can move forward. We have found that the unit is decent, safe, and sanitary. Fail means they have identified one or more items that poses a safety threat to the tenant, and we would like the owner to fix that prior to the tenant moving in. So common fail items may be, let's say there is the smoke detector, the battery isn't working, maybe there is an electrical outlet that doesn't have the plastic cover on that. In the briefing book, there are a list of commonly fail items that we often encourage owners to read so they have a greater chance of passing on the first time. And the third option that I mentioned is what we call inconclusive. Simply means we couldn't access the building or we couldn't access a particular room within that particular unit. So if it passes, then we'll move on to step 7, which is we will execute a lease and a HAP contract. And as you saw from the triangle, the owner and the family are going to execute the lease, and the housing authority and the owner are going to execute the HAP contract. And after the HAP contract is executed, a certification is processed in our software, which will generate a payment to the owner. Now take a look at the slide again. Notice 8 says future moves, and notice number 8 connects directly with number 4. Notice it does not connect with number 1, 2, and 3. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why. If somebody wants to move, they've already been determined eligible for the program. So every time they move, we don't have to do steps 1, 2, and 3 because they have already done that. But they would have to do steps 4 through 7. They have to get a voucher, have to turn an RTA, have to do an inspection, and have to sign the contracts all over again in that new unit. So let's talk about our activities. Like we said before, an annual recertification is once a year. We verify family income and composition. An annual housing quality standards inspection is once a year. We verify that the unit is decent, safe, and sanitary. Interims, we could have 0 interims or we could have numerous interims. Those are usually determined by the family. If the family experiences a change in composition due to someone moving in or someone moving out, or a change in income due to getting additional money or losing a particular income source or having their salary reduced, we will conduct an interim and adjust their rent based on those changes. And as we said before, if the family violates the program rules, which are located on the voucher, they could be subject to what's called termination. So let's talk about the occupancy cycle. So a family goes through all of the process from waiting list pull, or actually applying to be on the waiting list, to the execution of the HAP contract. After they execute the HAP contract, we are going to process what's called a certification in our software, which is known as Elite. So what is a certification? A certification is us processing something in our system of record, which goes to HUD, that generates the payment to the landlord. So that very first certification to a family who's coming onto the program for the first time is called an Action Code 1. Code number 1 is when they come onto the program. Now, as we said, every year we need to verify who is in the unit and how much money they make. So we call that an annual recertification, which is called Action Code 2. If there are changes throughout the year, those are called interims. Some families have no interims. Usually you'll have elderly families on a fixed income tend to have very little interims. Why? Social Security does not change except for the first of the year. But if the family has a large family with multiple sources of income, you could be more likely to have an interim, and we call those Action Code 3s. If the family is found to have violated the program rules, they could be subject to termination. Now, in the Constitution, it states no person shall be deprived of their property without be given due process. The voucher is actually considered the tenant's property. So we cannot take away that voucher willy-nilly just because I decided you broke the rules. The family has a right to due process, which means if the family disagrees with the decision to remove their voucher, they have the right to request what's called an informal hearing. An informal hearing is conducted by a hearing officer who is an unbiased person, kind of like Judge Judy, who evaluates the circumstances of the case and determines whether or not there is a preponderance of evidence, meaning there is more evidence to show that the family violated the rules, than there is to show that they did not. If the hearing officer determines that the PHA met its standard and proved that the family did in fact violate the rules, the family will be terminated from the program, and as you can see, that will end the occupancy cycle. That is called Action Code 6. If the hearing officer determines that there is not sufficient evidence to determine that the family violated the rules, the family will be reinstated and their housing will resume until in which the housing authority either does have sufficient evidence, or if they don't, they will continue to be on the program. This is a subsidy for life. There are no term limits. All right, so now I want to talk about different types of housing types there are within the affordable housing industry. And I want to introduce a concept to you that is called what's called project-based subsidy. So project-based subsidy means this. The subsidy is attached to the project. So when a family moves into that unit, they receive subsidized rent, meaning it's affordable based on their income. When the family leaves that particular unit, the subsidy does not go with them, it stays in the project. So an example of that would be what's called public housing. Public housing is housing that is owned by the Housing Authority of Miami-Dade. There's approximately 9,200 units, and if a family were to leave public housing, they cannot take that with them. The subsidy stays at the project. So as you can see, the legal relationship between the family and the housing authority in project-based housing is the housing authority is exercising the property management function, meaning they are executing the lease with the family. Now I want to introduce another concept that is what's called tenant-based subsidy. In tenant-based subsidy, the family can choose their unit, and if they decide to move to a different area, the subsidy goes with them. So they have a little bit more freedom in the type of housing that they want to live in. So an example of tenant-based subsidy would be what's called Housing Choice Voucher. Now, Housing Choice Voucher is, like we talked about before, or sometimes referred to as Section 8. The family is issued a voucher, they choose the unit, and if they move, the subsidy goes with them. But there's another type of Section 8 assistance that you should be aware of, which is called project-based Section 8. And we actually administer that here at Nan McKay through the county. Now, Project Section 8 is a little bit different. They take a little bit of the money that was designated for housing choice vouchers, and they designate that for one particular building. So in project-based Section 8, again, the subsidy is attached to the project because it aligns with our project-based definition we spoke of before. And if the family leaves that particular unit, the subsidy does not go with them. It stays at the project. Now, there is a little caveat that if a family has lived in a project-based unit for 1 year, they are eligible to receive a tenant-based voucher. But while they're in that project-based subsidy, if they want to leave for whatever reason and they're not eligible for a tenant-based voucher yet, the subsidy stays at that project. So tenant-based stays with the family, project-based stays with the building. So I want to talk about some other programs that you should be aware of at the Miami-Dade Housing Authority that we administer here. Now, one program you probably will hear is called FSS, or otherwise referred to as Family Self-Sufficiency. Now, Family Self-Sufficiency is a great program because Y is one of the few programs that HUD has that is designed to get families out of poverty into what's called suitable job to have what's called a living wage. Not a minimum wage job, but a living wage job, which is designed to have a job where an individual can meet all of their financial obligations without having to rely on any subsidy from the government. So we administer that program directly here. There's two components of family self-sufficiency. There's case management and there is escrow. Case management basically means that if their person has a barrier, they can't find childcare, they can't get access to education, their car doesn't work, we provide services, referrals to help them with that barrier. This particular local agency can help you with childcare. This particular agency can help you with transportation. So case management is basically identifying barriers that the family has towards their path towards self-sufficiency and working with them to remove those barriers. Another aspect of family self-sufficiency is a lot of times low-income families have a hard time getting out of poverty because of their inability to save money. So HUD actually will create an escrow account for them. And every time they have an increase in rent, that extra money goes into their escrow account. And if they graduate from the family self-sufficiency program, they are entitled to receive all of the money that they've accumulated in their escrow account. We've had some cases where that's $10,000, which is quite a lot of money. Now, some families can use that money, which transitions to our next program, which is called home ownership. They can use the money towards a down payment on a home. And home ownership is another program where we utilize funds designated for Housing Choice Voucher Program, but rather than help them with their housing, we actually help them pay their mortgage. So home ownership is designed to be a first-time home buyer program. So we will work with the family to try and get them qualified for a loan, and for a specific period, we will actually help them meet the mortgage expense. So we will pay the subsidy to them or to the bank to make their mortgage affordable. Another housing program type you will hear is called VASH. VASH is a program that is specifically designated from homeless veterans. It kind of works like the regular Housing Choice Voucher Program, but it's what's called targeted funding, meaning it's designated for a specific population group. This particular population group is homeless veterans. So how this works is rather than pulling a family from the waiting list, we'll get a referral from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We will determine if the veteran is eligible for the program, and if they are, we will issue them a voucher. So you should be familiar every time you hear VASH, that is a voucher that has been designated for a veteran who was previously homeless. Now there's lots of other different housing types of programs that you'll hear about, but those are the primary ones that we want you to be aware of because those are the ones we work with here at Miami-Dade. So the last thing I want to talk about is where do you find the rules? So the rules are very important. To quote Nan McKay, if you can't point to the rule on paper, it doesn't exist. So we are subject to strict audits and strict requirements, so we need to know where we can find the rules. Well, we can find the rules in a document called the Code of Federal Regulations, or commonly referred to as the CFR. Now, within the Code of Federal Regulations, we have various parts. If I were to give you the entire CFR, I would have a book that would literally go to the ceiling. But we only care about certain parts of the CFR because they apply to our program. The first part we have is what's called Part 5, which actually applies to all housing programs. So HUD didn't want to be redundant. When the rules are the same for all the programs, they decided to put them all in the same place. Another part you should be familiar with is what's called Part 982. Part 982 contains the Housing Choice Voucher program regulations. And at the end of the show notes, we'll give you a link on how you can directly access the CFRs so you can play around and see what the CFRs look like and how to locate the rules. Now, HUD's thought when they designed this program is, so we have housing authorities from Hawaii to Miami to Puerto Rico to Manhattan, Kansas to Manhattan, New York. And as you can imagine, the housing needs in Manhattan, Kansas are going to be very different to the housing needs in Manhattan, New York. So there are certain program rules that apply to all housing authorities that are within what is called the CFR. But HUD also gave each housing authority the flexibility to establish local rules when perhaps it wouldn't make sense for HUD to have a national policy on that particular issue. So you should also be aware of a document which is called our administrative plan or our policies. The administrative plan is the housing authority's policies that are aligned with the CFR, but go more specific than the CFR when HUD gives the housing authority flexibility to determine how the program should be designed. So as we saw, the purpose of the administrative plan is to ensure that all of our decisions are aligned, that we have consistent actions, and as we know, as a public housing authority, our decisions are often questioned, whether it be an auditor, the public, PACD. So our decisions are more defendable when they are on paper. To quote Nan McKay, if the rule doesn't exist on paper, it doesn't exist. So staff can't make it up as they go. The administrative plan guides your day-to-day work. And in the notes for the show, there will be a link so you can directly access the administrative plan. In conclusion, I want to thank you all for watching this section called Housing 101. We hope you found it helpful to review, hopefully as a result of this training. You have gained an awareness about why affordable housing is so important in the Miami-Dade County area. You have a better understanding of how the structure of the Miami-Dade Housing Authority is and how it operates and how Nan McKay fits into that. You understand the process, or at least the Cliff Notes version of the chronological order that things must occur from the family's point of view on how to get on the program and stay on the program. You understand some different housing types of programs that exist, and you have an understanding on where to find the program rules. Hope you've enjoyed this session. Click next to take a little quiz.